Yes, okay. Hello, now it is recorded. Just paused it for a second there, unfortunately. Okay, so yes, please note that this forum is recorded and will be made available to the public. If you do not want to be seen or heard, but want to participate, please note that you can change yourself to anonymous by changing your name and leaving your questions in the chat. If you have any issues, please send me a private message in the chat. If you would like to be added to the mailing list, please send me a message or email me after the session. The first half hour will be presentations with polls. Professor Jeremy Mann will indicate to you when to answer these questions. You can find the poll questions in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. The polls can then be used as reference for the second half of the session. The second half will consist of randomly assigned breakout groups. This will happen automatically. You will just have to accept to enter the room. There will be discussion points given to you on the share screen, and you can also talk to the results of the poll at this time. We will have 10 minutes to share your views in smaller groups. I will choose a spokesperson from each group who will then report back for a maximum of 5 minutes. I will send you a 1-minute warning from your chat, so just keep an eye on that. If you are, for whatever reason, unable to be a spokesperson, please send me a private message during the presentation and I will make sure I don't put you in that position. If anything I've said here is unclear, please send me a message and I'll clarify. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm now going to hand over to Professor Jeremy Mann.
Thanks, Aysha. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me all right? Aysha, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
And the angle of the camera is fine?
Perfect.
Okay. I'm just going to share my screen. So, can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon. My presentation is going to be, I guess, a very brief historical review of I guess, an initiative that has spanned close to 5 decades now. And it's really on the emergence of sustainable development. But I'm going to try and view this through the lens of the survival of quality life on Earth. This is my presentation outline. So I'll review the developments as driven by the United Nations. And I'll also review the response of other stakeholders, industry, the African Union, academia, and specifically UCT and our collaborators, and even some NGOs. And I'll look at the outputs of each of these individual endeavors. And then we'll take a reality check and see how well we are preserving or improving the quality of life in Africa. And then lastly, I'll present some of the latest data on Africa's population dynamics and a forecast for the future. But before I get started, I'd like you to answer, if you will, the poll question number 1. If we're looking at the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, which he put forth in 1987, which was that it's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own. I'd like you to select one of the options there on how successful we've actually been achieving this to date. In other words, today in 2020. You can do that while I talk. My presentation includes a lot of slides, but I'm not proposing at all to try and go through any of them in any detail, but I have included them for your information. I've given a copy of the presentation to Aysha, and she'll make it available to you if she hasn't done it already. So first of all, I want us to look at the timeline of the United Nations endeavors. So Sweden first suggested to the United Nations Economic and Social Council in 1968 the idea of having a UN conference to focus on human interactions and the environment. And in 1969, it was decided to convene a conference and to be hosted by Sweden, and that would be in 1972, the UN Conference on Human Environment in Stockholm, so the UNHCS that was called. The preparations for the conference were extensive, lasting 4 years, including 104 governments and costing over $30 million. Conference was duly held, and then thereafter, meetings every 10 years, so-called Earth Summits, were organized by the United Nations to stimulate sustainable development at a global level. The second one, and not really spoken and maybe not even monitored as an Earth Summit, took place in Nairobi in 1982. But at the time, the events of the time, you were just in the Cold War, and there was a great disinterest from the US president at the time, President Ronald Reagan, and the summit turned out to be a failure, and it's not even mentioned as an official Earth Summit. The third was in Rio in 1992, then in Johannesburg, and then in Rio again, Rio 20 plus in 2012. What I've also shown you is the World Conference on Human Rights, which was held in Vienna in 1993. I'm not sure, but I think it was for the first time that formal goals were set for human development as a necessary requirement for sustainable development. These were over and above the goals that had been set in the climate control change forum. And I've also shown you a couple of the so-called Conference of Parties, the CRPs of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where the other significant milestone agreements were reached. This slide is really looking at the significant outputs from those summits. The 1972 UN Conference on Human Environment resulted in the Stockholm Declaration. And this was a common outlook for the first time, with common principles to inspire and guide the peoples of the world in the preservation and enhancement of the human environment. And it was at this conference that the United Nations Environmental Programme, or UNEP, was established. In December 1983, despite the failure of the 1982 Earth Summit, the World Commission on Environmental Development was established under the leadership of Gro Harman Brundtland, which delivered its report, Our Common Future, in October 1987. And this is where that definition that I've asked you to comment on really was tabled. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol, and this was an international treaty designed to protect the ozone layer by phasing out the production of numerous substances that were responsible for ozone depletion, was concluded. And it has since had undergone 9 revisions. And this has probably been the most successful UN sustainable development intervention, because it looks like the ozone layer will be reinstated by 2030 to its original levels at the time. But I guess probably the most significant Earth Summit was the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which set the scene for continued global collaboration on a number of sustainability issues. It had the following significant outputs. There was the Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development, Agenda 21, and the Forest Principles. And the following legal agreements were open for signature. There was the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. I'll be showing a number of slides following these outputs in more detail. The parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Control have met annually since 1995 in conferences of the parties to address progress in dealing with climate change. And in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was concluded, And this established a legally binding obligation for developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in the period 2008 to 2012. After a number of COP meetings from 2009 and 2011, the protocol was amended in 2012 to encompass the period from 2013 to 2020. And in 2015, the Paris Agreement agreed to keeping a global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius from 2020 onwards. On the human development front, in 1993, the Vienna Declaration and Programme for Action affirmed that extreme poverty and social exclusion constitute a violation of human dignity. And it reaffirmed the right to development, and that the least developed countries should be supported by the international community. And in September 2000, a 3-day Millennium Summit in New York at the UN headquarters, the UN Assembly agreed the Millennium Declaration, which includes 8 chapters, 32 paragraphs, and 60 goals. And this is what led to the reworked Millennium Development Goals, which we're all fully aware of, I think. Although there were major advancements and improvements achieving some of the MDGs, even before the deadline of 2015, the progress had been uneven between countries and regions. So the post of the 2015 development agenda process to define future global development framework that would succeed the MDGs was initiated in 2012. At the Rio Earth Summit that year, a resolution known as the Future We Want was reached by the member states. And in January 2013, a 30-member UN General Assembly Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals was established, specifically to identify goals for SDGs to succeed the MDGs. And the final document on the SDGs was adopted by the UN Sustainable Development Summit in September 2015 in New York. I'm sure that there are many other significant outputs that have come from the Earth Summits, but I thought that perhaps these were the ones most significant for us to talk about. This is the Stockholm Declaration, the very first one. It was a declaration containing 26 principles, which you can see there, an action plan with 109 recommendations with a resolution. I think the seminal issue that emerged from the conference is the recognition of the connection between poverty alleviation and protecting the environment. At the conference itself, divisions developed between the developed and the developing countries. They started becoming quite apparent. And at the time, the developing nations supported the creation of UNEP, not because they supported environmental governance, but because the location of its headquarters was going to be in Nairobi, Kenya. And this would be the first UN agency that would be based in a developing country. The Rio Summit of 1992 is probably the most significant Earth Summit and set the scene for continued global collaboration on a number of sustainable issues. And I've spoken about those earlier. This was the actual declaration. It contained 27 principles, reaffirming the Stockholm Declaration of 1972, and indeed seeking to build upon it. The Agenda 22 was the action plan that the UN agreed with regard to sustainable development. The 21 in Agenda 21 refers to the original target year of 2021, by when it was hoped to have achieved the development goals. The document is divided into 40 chapters that have been grouped into 4 sections, as you can see on this slide. It makes very interesting reading if you actually take the document and read it. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was made available for signature then, It really is presented here just as a summary slide. You can read it later. But the ultimate objective of the convention is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. I don't think any of you need to be told about that. Slide 10. I don't think I need to talk about this. I'm sure that you have all at least seen them before. The Johannesburg Declaration, the reason I put this slide up here is because it was here for the first time that recognition was given to non-governmental agencies participating in sustainable development. In my view, for the first time, empowering the voice of communities via, albeit this was via NGOs or other civil society actors. These, of course, are the Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed in 2015 and need no further discussion. The point I wish to make by the preceding slides is that in creating this roadmap for the sustainability of mankind, this was not the work of what many saw as bunny huggers or tree huggers or even environmental extremists. It was a considered strategic international approach developed by credible working groups who consulted extensively and continue to do so and based it on scientific evidence. If you now look at the industry response, in 1990, Maurice Strong, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, was looking for a leader to inject a business voice into the global conversation on sustainability on environmental issues, especially at the upcoming Rio conference in 1992. So he charged Stefan Schmidheiny with the responsibility, and he recruited 48 CEOs from around the world to begin discussions. And in 1991, a Business Council for Sustainable Development was born. And in June 1992, at the conference, their report entitled Changing Course was presented. On the 1st of January 1995, the council merged with the World Industry Council for the Environment to form a new World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the WBCSD. In 1997, the Global Reporting Initiative was founded. The GRI Sustainability Reporting Standards are now the first and most widely adopted global standards for sustainability reporting. The Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, initiated in 2000, is a collaborative effort by governments, multinational extractive companies, and NGOs to provide guidance to companies on tangible steps that they can take to minimize the risk of human rights abuses in communities located near the extraction sites. As of 2019, participants in the initiative include 10 national governments, 29 companies, and 15 non-governmental organizations. The United Nations Global Compact, also established in 2000, is a non-binding United Nations pact to encourage businesses worldwide to adopt sustainable and socially responsible policies and to report on the implementation. With more than 13,000 corporate participants and other stakeholders and over 170 participating countries, it has two primary objectives. The first, to mainstream its 10 principles in the business activities around the world. I'll show you them a bit later. And to catalyze actions in support of the broader UN goals, such as the MDGs and more lately, the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2000, the Carbon Disclosure Project was established. Now, this is an organization based in the United Kingdom, which aims to make environmental reporting and risk management a business norm and drive disclosure insight and action towards a sustainable economy. Since 2002, more than 8,400 companies have publicly disclosed environmental information through the CDP. I guess in terms of our sector, the mining sector, the most significant response was in 2000. A small group of mining and metal companies CEOs came together and initiated the Global Mining Initiative, the GMI. This initiative, led by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, commissioned the International Institute of Environmental and Development to undertake the Mining Minerals Sustainable Development Study. The GMI and the MMSD, together with the existing International Council on Metals and the Environment, ICME, gave rise to the creation of what's now known as the International Council of Mining and Metals in 2001. The results of the MMSD initiative, titled Resourcing the Future, were presented at a global conference in Toronto in 2002 and marked the end of the GMI. And it was here that the participating CEOs of ICMM signed up to a list of commitments titled the Toronto Declaration. And in 2003, the ICMM rolled out the 10 defining mining principles. In 2001, the FTSE Group, this is a joint venture between the Financial Times of London and the London Stock Exchange, launched the FTSE for Good Index, which is a series of ethical investment stock market indices. And in 2003, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative was founded. This is a global standard to promote the open and accountable management of oil, gas, and mineral resources. And it requires disclosure of information along the extractive value chain, from the point of extraction to how revenues make their way through government and how they benefit the public. It has 61 company supporters, 35 in mining, 20 in oil and gas, 4 state-owned entities, and 1 commodity trader and another industry partner. And 69 countries have been validated or in the process of being validated. In 2012, the Responsible Mining Index was created. The MRI report is an evidence-based assessment of the economic, environmental, social, and governance, so ESG, policies and practice. And the most recent report, the 2020 report, I'll talk about later, includes 38 large-scale mining companies that operate in more than 780 mine sites, and together account for about 28% of the world's mining activity by value of production. In 2013, they formed a corporate human rights benchmark company. It's a non-for-profit company and was launched as a multi-stakeholder initiative to assess the largest publicly traded companies in the world on a set of human rights indicators. At the World Economic Forum annual meeting in 2013, the governors for the mining and metals industry cluster asked the forum to prepare a scoping paper on the role and contribution of mining and metals in the sustainable world. And in 2014, together with Accenture, they produced a seminal scoping paper entitled Mining and Metals in a Sustainable World. In early 2001, the Kellogg Innovation Network Catalyst Conference was held in Brazil. And this was really to envision the mining company of the future. At this event, it was concluded that the mining industry must unequivocally accept the need for a new operating model to ensure long-term profitability and success. And following the Ken Catalyst, the Development Partner Working Group was convened, and their output was the Development Partner Framework, which was launched in early 2014. In 2015, the Financial Services Board Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures was established by the FSB of the G20 countries to develop voluntary, consistent climate-related financial risk disclosures for companies in providing information to investors, lenders, insurers, and other stakeholders. So this was really reporting to inform investors and lenders. And in 2016, the World Economic Forum, in partnership with the Columbia Center of Sustainable Investment and others, developed the white paper mapping mining to sustainable development goals, an atlas. The aim of this atlas was to encourage mining companies of all sizes to incorporate relevant SDGs into their businesses and operations and validate their current efforts and spark new ideas. So you can see that there's been a significant response from industry. The following slides are really just information slides for your perusal during the discussions if necessary. These were the principles of the UN Compact signed in 2000. These are the ICMM mining principles developed as a result of the MMSD initiative. These are the ICMM mining outputs. There's a number of slides 16 to 23. So there's a significant number of outputs, and I've listed them by year just to go through them. Generally, the outputs are in the form of principles, policies, procedures, requirements, guidance, good practice, toolkits, reviews, case studies, progress reviews, reports, and responses. Unfortunately, there's a general perception that most of the outputs are transactional. In other words, they're proactive looking to maximize rewards and minimize penalties in a changing landscape of external stakeholder and societal requirements, promoting compliance rather than changing the future. However, in my view, not all of the industry outputs have been transactional. These are the transformative outputs that really seek to change the future. The Mining, Minerals and Sustainable Development Initiative was an unprecedented multi-stakeholder consultation and research process that took place over 2 years. It involved 20 regional or national consultations, listening to more than 5,000 individuals and organizations about the role of mining and metals, how they could play in the transition to sustainable development. It also produced 175 research reports and papers from across the globe. The Global Policy Institute published a review, and Carolyn, I see you're here. You were involved in it by the former project coordinator and project director, capturing the insights gained during this extraordinary undertaking. And I believe it's a seminal paper that should be looked at as we try and transform mining in a sustainable future. I really think that we're going to have to move towards a multi-stakeholder effort rather than working in the enclaves that we are currently. I think the Kellogg's Institute Catalyst Development Partner Framework is also transformational, as are the 2 World Economic Forum white papers. What I'd like you to do now, having heard this, is ask you the question, the poll question, and ask you to answer it, whether these industry transformative outputs have moved even slightly from an aspiration towards a reality. And now I want to have a look at Africa's response. Africa at the time of the first Earth Summit was very definitely in the enclave of poor and underdeveloped countries. Most countries were struggling to rid themselves of the legacy of colonialization, and South Africa was still governed under an apartheid regime. Africa's response to SDG, as shown here, really only started around about the time of the Johannesburg Earth Summit in 2002. Moves had already been afoot to start harmonizing regional mining policy with the kickoff of the SADC mining strategy plan in 2002. And at the 2002 World Sustainability Earth Summit in Johannesburg, the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals and Metals, the IFG, was established. The IGF, is focused on improving resource governance and decision-making by governments working in the sector. And at the same time, as part of the agreed implementation plan of the WSSD, Section 8 specifically tabled the sustainable development for Africa. A series of initiatives and efforts at sub-regional, continental, and global levels followed, and they're listed here, to maximize the development outcomes of mineral resource exploitation. And in 2007, an international study group was commissioned by the UN Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, and the African Union to conduct a study on Africa's mineral regimes. They tabled a final report in 2001 entitled Minerals in Africa Development. But in 2008, UNECA convened a meeting to draft the new Africa mining vision, which was formally adopted by the African heads of state and government in February 2009. The draft implementation plan for the AMV was signed off in 2011. In May 2013, 50 years after the foundation of the Organization of the African Union, at the anniversary, a plan was called for the next 50 years. And the African Union Development Agency of NEPAD developed the Agenda 2006, the Africa We Want, which was formally adopted by the AU in 2015. I've tried to look for a progress report on the implementation of the African mining vision, and if there is one, it's certainly not easily accessible to the public. And the only progress report I have found was one done by Oxfam in 2017, entitled From Aspiration to Reality. Agenda 2063, however, has instituted a formal progress review system on the progress of implementation. And the first continental report on Agenda 2016 was released earlier this year. So there's been a change from pure aspiration, I think, in the African Union context to actually starting to monitor progress. This is for you who, I'm sure you all know the African mining vision. It was deliberately ambitious. It was seen as what was required to change the path and destiny of Africa's industrialization and fight against poverty, and to create a win-win outcomes for all the stakeholders at the same time meeting the Millennium Development Goals. Agenda 2063, which is probably not all that well known. The stated goals of this agenda are economic development, including the eradication of poverty within one generation, political integration, in particular through the establishment of a federal or confederate united Africa, improvements in democracy and justice, the establishment of security and peace on the entire African continent, strengthening of the cultural identity through an African Renaissance and Pan-African ideals, gender equality, and political independence from foreign powers. More specifically, these are the 7 aspirations of Agenda 2063. Following the recognition of Type 2 partnerships in Johannesburg Declaration, I looked to see which NGOs have been active in the SD space, particularly in Africa. And this is a list of the more significant ones I've found, and I'm sure that there are many more, and you could make your own contributions to who in this space is actually making a significant contribution. Well, so those are the responses that we've had from most of the stakeholders. So how are each of us doing? Let's start off by looking at industry first. Industry has certainly upped their game on sustainability reporting. These are the reports of the top 10 mining companies, and with the exception of Vali, they all look like glossy table top publications. They look pretty impressive and generally are filled with good news and validated case studies showing their positive contributions to society. All of them reporting compliance with many of these voluntary initiatives or public commitments I spoke about earlier. Very few of them actually qualify how well they are complying with these guidelines and standards. So I think it's more informative if we actually look at the reports generated by these initiatives and on how well the companies are doing according to their own yardsticks. And I will look at two of them. The first is the Responsible Mining Index report of 2020, actually. Presented here are the RMI framework, analytical framework. You can see there are 6 themes. Each of the themes have 3 areas of assessment. That's commitment, action, and effectiveness. And each thematic area has a number of specific indicators against which they are shown on the right here. If we look at the industry scores as assessed in the 2020 RMI report, they present a different perception to what one gets from the company reports to society. Extremely few of them have a score even above 3, the halfway mark of the scale. And all of them fall significantly short of the best practice benchmark, which is the red line that you see quite faintly on that. It's also evident that in most cases, corporate commitment is high, but action and effectiveness scores are low. And that's if you look at all 6 of the theme. So the issue that comes from this, I think the RMI report shows that a modest overall improvement on many issues by most of the companies previously assessed. The improvement is modest, and most of the improvement is due to companies making commitments with markedly less evidence of progress in following up these commitments with concrete action. Companies often highlight their sustainability reports. In their reports, they highlight the positive contributions they make to the SDGs, while they generally omit mentioning any of the negative impacts that would impede achievement of the SDGs. This one-sided reporting fails to present stakeholders with a true picture of the challenges that the mining sector faces in its support of the SDGs. And it highlights a disconnect between the company-wide policies and standards versus on-the-ground mine actions at mine sites, where the impacts of mining and the environment on communities are most evident. If we look at the second benchmark report, this is the corporate human rights benchmark. Shown here are the yardsticks and the average scores achieved by the extractive industry participants, and the score range they've achieved. If you look at the bottom left, the percentage achievement is pretty low. So it's 3.2 out of 10. So it's 32%. They're pretty low. Only 11 of the 56 participants scored about 50, above 50. And remember, these participants are the best in the industry. And yeah, once again, we get a different picture from what's put in the company reports to society. The current reality, in my view, is that despite all its efforts, industry is continuing to propagate its historical legacy issues. Just have a look at this list and see if you think that the current industry operations are now being conducted in a way that will ensure that none of these issues, which are all legacy issues, will arise again from their current operations. So let's look at Africa, how the African Union is doing. In terms of the African mining vision, as I said earlier, the only progress review I could find on the AMV was this one conducted by Oxfam. And as you can see, implementation has been slow, and there is a low level of awareness of the framework amongst key stakeholders in the mineral sector.
Sorry to interject.
Yep.
I just wanted to give you a warning. We need to try and wrap up quite soon so that
Sure.
we can start the group. Okay.
Great. And this is the progress on Agenda 2036, 63. Those are the individual scores. How are we doing as a UCT and our collaborators? Well, I think that we have a number of transformational outputs. I don't need to explain these to you. You know them. The key, there's a poll question here I'd like you to answer. In your view, are these UCT transformative outputs having any tangible impact on sustainable development in Africa? And then I just want to acknowledge two significant contributions by NGOs. The one is the holding of account of Oxfam for the African unity to the African mining vision, and then what I consider to be a transformational proposal from the Benchmark Foundation that provides a platform for empowering affected communities in problem solving. So how are we actually affecting the survival of quality in Africa? Well, we still have a significant disparity of income. And this is the Resource Governance Index. You can read of this. If you look at the shades, only Botswana is doing satisfactorily. Everybody else has poor and weak and even failing governance indexes. The Global Food Security Index in Africa, this is really in support of SDG 3. Most of us have improved as countries, but many of us, most of us are still below the 50% index. And this is the Natural Resources Resilience Index. What this shows is really that we are truly endowed with good and resilient natural resources in Africa. Poverty. Well, today, 1 in 3 Africans, that's 423 million people, live below the poverty line. This is more than 70% of the poor people, the poorest people in the world. The universal health coverage. Service coverage is lowest in the Africa region in the world. The infectious diseases, the risk of dying from the infectious disease is highest in Africa and Southeast Asia. This is SGC3. The Human Development Report, this is the foreword of the report. And as it shows you, inequality has really moved beyond income and averages. New equality gaps are opening. specifically in education and access to technology. These are the detailed HDIs. So what are the challenges really in terms of going forward? The top challenge for industry is really obtaining and maintaining the social license to operate. We have massive opportunity in terms of our resources. These are the mineral resources. As you can see there, Africa is well endowed with very good mineral resources. The population prospects are probably the biggest threat. We are looking at a population of 2.8 in 2050, and by 2100, that's going to be almost 4.7 billion. And what does that have? Well, this is what it actually does in terms of Africa's carrying capacity to support that population. There are some potential opportunities from that demographic. Everybody else is aging rapidly, whereas Africa has a demographic dividend of the largest workforce between 24 and 50. So this is really where Africa's potential lies, is that where the world is losing this working population, Africa has the potential to be supplying that, as we do in terms of our natural resources for agriculture.
Sorry, Jeremy. Oh, okay. No, there we go. Sorry. Just checking that we're on our last slide.
So really what I wanted to try and show you is that I think that we've really, all of the separate silos have done a significant amount of work in terms of sustainability and sustainable development. But the true measure of how well we are successful are really in the SDGs now and the indices that are coming out of that. And our current assessment is that we're improving, but if you look at the population prospects of Africa, I don't believe that we're doing enough fast enough, and we need to change the way we're doing things. So these are the breakout discussions I'd really like us to do. I'll hand back to you. Aysha.
Okay, great. So I will be separating everyone into groups, and there'll be approximately 10 or so people in each group, and I will then send you one of the 3 breakout discussions topics, unless you want to discuss any other ones or all 3 of them, and you will have 10 minutes to do that discussion. Okay. If there's any struggles on your side, please let me know. Okay, so all the breakout rooms are open, so you can start joining them now. Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for being willing to join smaller groups and open the discussion up into our little shared experiences, maybe. So the first spokesperson is Nicole. Would you like to just kind of share with us for 5 minutes? Sorry, we're going over time now. So as quickly as possible, what your group spoke about.
All right, so just to repeat the question that we got, what needs to be done to move industry's transformative outputs from aspiration to reality? And so we said that the first one was collaboration, and in order to do that, we needed increased communication, but communication wasn't good enough. We needed to make sure we were building and developing common understandings and perspectives of different problems. We needed to build trust, and also to do that, we needed to increase transparency, and particularly because companies and communities don't seem to trust each other. Companies are worried about their reputation. No one seems to be trusting government from the sounds of things. And then another point that was raised with these visions is who owns and takes responsibility for the implementations. And the comment we came up with is that we need to develop a sense of ownership of the visions and goals, otherwise they won't gain traction, and that needs to happen at a community level, at government level, and at a country level. We also need to somehow be able to enforce accountability amongst the different stakeholders for this implementation. And then we also said, as sort of evidence by the lack of implementation or converting the African mining vision into reality, that there's a general lack of good political governance and assigning sort of agencies and people to start implementing these various goals and visions. And then the comment that came from there is, okay, once we get to that place, we need to make sure that we've built capacity to support these various agencies that are being tasked with its implementation. I think those are the sort of main points that our group came up with. Thanks.
Thank you. And Deval, would you mind sharing a video and sharing a little bit about the group, what you guys discussed?
Cool. Hello. Yeah. Okay. So very briefly, first of all, the question, let me pull that up again. The question was about specifically UCT's role, more or less, and saying, how can we change our approach so that the UCT transformative outputs, those documents that Jeremy mentioned, or in general, the work that UCT is doing in this space, realize a tangible impact on the sustainable development of Africa. So I think the first theme there was more or less to say, hold up, yes, we are doing important work, right, on an academic level, and that there is a role for a university or an academic institution to play in this context. But defining exactly what that role is a bit of a sticking point. And not necessarily a sticking point, but something that needs a bit more analysis and trying to figure out exactly what the best way is for academic institutions to have a meaningful impact. So the first thing is that the biggest probably place for a university in this sense is to say that they are there to come up with the new ways of doing things, looking at things critically and examining, potentially different and better ways of approaching problems that have been done in a very systematic way beforehand. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the implementation and so on goes directly in hand with that. So there's definitely a large space and that's a much bigger, let's say, forum needed for communication and dialogue between academic institutions and the industry and other stakeholders who are ultimately going to be people putting these things into place and dealing with these, the various issues that are brought up in that context. So on the other hand, we also heard about how it's important that we try and do research that does have an impact, or as opposed to just, you can think about it like academics just worrying away in their corner and not really knowing what's going on in the real world. But trying to sort of balance those two things is a bit of a difficult issue, I think. We also heard that on the other hand, the industry is interested in this kind of engagement and has its own set of problems that it wants to try and address, and sees that there is a potential role for the academy to play in that context. Yeah, and then I sort of mentioned it, but just to add on there that, you know, the university is one set of people and one set of stakeholders, and the industry is another set of stakeholders. But there are a number of other communities and groups of people who are also important to these kind of discussions, and they must also not be left out necessarily in this kind of discussion. Cool, that's me.
Cool, thanks, Deval. And then we have Layla from the third group.
Hi. Okay, so our question was, how can we harness the potential of Africa's population prospects to create a sustainable future for Africa? So one of the first points mentioned or brought up was that we should have a guide in terms of educational with regards to technological exposure, which could be a potential asset. And the other point that was brought up similar to that was how the youth of South Africa is very technologically inclined, and how due to the COVID-19 pandemic, well, UCT as an institution, as many other institutions, have been able to convey or have been able to convey information and have online you know, virtual teachings and remote studying remotely. The other point that was brought up in terms of sustainability was educating the youth on renewable energy. This is important because there's uncertainty with regards to how much of non-renewable resources we have, and how long would be able to generate electricity from coal, for example. One very important point that was also brought up was that although youth can be educated and, you know, they could have tertiary education and all of that, however, how is the access to employment? Are they guaranteed to be employed after that? And in terms of we need to have more practical ways of having the younger generation have access to the economy. So for instance, have skill training colleges where they could get work experience while studying. And I suppose, yeah, that's all of it in a nutshell.
Thank you. I think it brought quite a few things to light, all three discussions speaking about the role of academia and how, what role do we play? Are we skill providers? Are we implementers? It's a multifaceted question. I guess we're all kind of wondering, especially as students, where do we fall in this dynamic? What role do we play? And then how do we take our knowledge into the world and implement sustainable development goals? Jeremy, do you have any points that you would like to add? Can I give you the floor?
First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for participating. I'd like you all to, if you have any comments about the format, because this is really a guinea pig approach today, how we can improve it, whether it worked for you or not, whether it's something we should try and use further. I'd like those comments. In terms of the feedback, I'm enthused by a number of common themes that are coming out. I think it's clear that the way forward for impact development is that it has to be integrated. So it means it needs to be multi-stakeholder, and not done in the silos as we've tended to work previously. I think the way that we're going to be able to create a common understanding of what the goal value is that we would collectively have to start developing an appreciation of the shared value, shared benefits, and shared accountabilities that each of the stakeholders need to do in terms of developing solutions and implementing solutions, and refining solutions. But if it's done in a way that's really to achieve a common goal where we're all benefiting from, that's probably the answer. So I think that when we roadmap these sort of long-term developments for sustainability, particularly in Africa, and we look at the potential and also the threats that are very real in Africa, we need to actually see how we become more inclusive in trying to develop solutions for Africa, because ultimately the beneficiary of Africa for sustainable development are not going to be the academia, they're not going to be governments, they're not going to be companies, they're going to be the communities at sites where we operate. And we need to find solutions collectively with them. And I think those sort of threads came through. And so I was very happy about it. I think that we won't have any answers right now. I really think that we should start a dialogue now, and try and expand this, because that's what can help us improve our impact. Yep, that's
Thank
me.
you. Thanks. Yeah, I suppose that's what the forum's here for, is hopefully this is part of that platform, part of that collaboration that we seek to establish. I know that I'm myself am a bit of a guinea pig coming from the law faculty into the chemical engineering space. So hopefully that's part of the bridging silos. But yeah, I'm really glad everyone could navigate this new type of forum, I suppose. We're still trying to figure out this whole online platform and how to make sure that it's more engaging and get people to speak up as well. Hopefully that the interactive elements like the poll and breaking out into different groups allowed for that to happen. Feedback, welcome, please. And otherwise, the recording will be sent through shortly, probably in the next day. And otherwise, thank you so much for joining us.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you.
Aysha, do we at another occasion want to have a bit of a review of the process?
I think that I might send out another poll. Yeah, I think I'll try and reach out to individuals and see. I think it's difficult to give feedback on this platform. People are like, but I think it went well. I enjoyed it. But I was hopping from one group to the other, so I didn't get a full picture of any group. But it was, yeah, it was fun. And I shared the file with them before, well, during the chat. So in the chat. So I hope everyone got to see that before logging out. Otherwise, I'll just actually send it to them. I'll send an email.
No problems.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for all your assistance.
Not a problem.
Okay. Cheers.
Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Bye. Ciao.
if anyone has any comments that they want to give, there's only 6 of us, you can go for it.
I actually will just give a quick comment. I also got detached. I've had to come in again a different way. But just to say, when you're doing those breakout groups, it's a really good idea to make sure that you've identified who's in your group, and that should be part of the format. Because I was rather taken by surprise by some of the people whose names I didn't recognize, and I may have presented differently if I had an idea of who they were. So it's somehow we're not logging in.
It's difficult to do so because we don't have a set register beforehand. So I can't allocate groups and then tell people who's going to be in their groups.
Maybe just say that the first minute or so, just say your institution or your company.
Introduce yourselves. Yeah, for sure.
Because then you're talking to a context instead of we had an awkward few seconds, you recognized a few names.
But you don't know where everyone's coming from.
Rest. And if they didn't talk, you actually still have no idea who they were. So,
yeah, and it's a short period as well, so you feel like pressured to say something.
Just say quickly your name.
Introduce yourself to the group.
You could say share. When you're in those smaller groups, you could almost do a quick screen share, or I don't know, some quick way of doing it. But I think it really would have been a good idea. We had some fantastic people, but we didn't utilize them as well as we could have if we been clear who they were.
Yeah, I think the next step would be to focus primarily on half of the session being completely just separate groups, and then coming back and the actual presentation is from each spokesperson, so that you guys have longer to speak.
Yeah, I thought Jeremy's presentation was fascinating, but it could almost have been done as an online lecture. It was could have been read up by participants before and done more briefly, but the slides themselves were so interesting.
Have you've seen them there? I sent them through in the chat. Hopefully.
Yeah. I will look and find them, but I do think they are very valuable. And I felt, it would have been wonderful to have more people.
Beforehand as well.
Well, we should have invited people to access that. It was an incredible resource.
I'll send it through as well.
Yeah, that would be great.
To the groups. But yeah, definitely. I think it's also an introduction at the beginning. So just having direct access to the poll questions beforehand and during, and then also the discussion points during the process, being able to look at them quite easily would have been preferable. I think I definitely just threw people in the deep end a little bit, but I think it worked, hopefully. Okay, I think I'm going to end the meeting now for everyone. Thank you so much for joining and for giving me some feedback. I appreciate it a lot.